The day begins before the sun has even gathered the energy to rise. In the quiet darkness of a one-room cottage, surrounded by snoring, coughing, and the occasional twitch from a nearby pig or child, a medieval peasant slowly stirs from what can barely be called sleep. Their bed is a sack of straw, stuffed with more mites and lice than actual stuffing. The straw pokes at the skin through a thin layer of linen, and every movement is an invitation for another itch. Sleep is shallow and mostly restless, disturbed by the cold, the damp, and the snoring of several other family members, all crammed together on the same pile of shared misery. There's no pillow. Just a rolled-up piece of wool, if lucky, or maybe a wooden plank covered with a rag. There's no mattress either. Only straw. And that straw rarely gets changed. Because changing it means getting new straw, and new straw is usually needed to feed animals. So, human comfort waits. Sometimes for weeks. Sometimes months. The rooster crows before dawn. It always crows. Right outside the tiny, cracked wooden door that barely keeps the cold out. The sound isn't cheerful or pastoral. It's shrill and aggressive, like a medieval alarm clock that nobody can snooze. You wake up whether you want to or not. There is no fire yet. The embers from last night's hearth are cold and useless. To get warmth, someone, often the oldest child or the most unlucky adult, has to get up and rekindle it. This means walking barefoot across a dirt floor in the dark, feeling every stick, rock, or dried bit of who knows what left behind by the animals that occasionally wander inside. There is no bathroom. There is no toilet. There is a chamber pot, if you're lucky. Or there's the outdoors. In winter, going outside to relieve yourself means risking frostbite on your most delicate parts. In summer, it means stepping into mud that might not be entirely made of water. The only certainty is that you'll be doing it quickly, and without dignity. After the rooster comes the cold water. There's no sink. Just a wooden bucket, sometimes filled the night before. If it's winter, the top layer is frozen. You crack it open with your fingers or a stick. Washing your face in it is less refreshing and more a way to make sure you're fully, painfully awake. There is no soap. Maybe a scrap of ash or sand if someone remembered. Then there's dressing, though the word makes it sound more complex than it is. Most peasants sleep in what they wear during the day. Night clothes and day clothes are the same. Woolen tunic, rough linen, maybe a cloak in the winter if you didn't burn it for firewood. The clothes haven't been washed in weeks. Sometimes months. They smell like everything: smoke, sweat, manure, and yesterday's dinner. That is, if there was a dinner. Next comes the thrilling task of stepping outside. The wooden door creaks open on hinges that groan like they resent the idea of morning. You step out barefoot into soft mud. Sometimes not so soft. And often not just mud. Manure from animals, waste from the previous day, all mixed together into something that sticks to your feet and soul. Animals shuffle and snort. Pigs are rooting through filth. Chickens are flapping around, already making their tiny demands. Cows are mooing for hay. Everything wants food or milking. And it's your job to give it to them. Before you even think of feeding yourself. The first task might be milking a goat or cow. Kneeling in cold mud, placing your hands on a swollen udder, praying the animal doesn't kick you. If you're lucky, the milk is still warm. If not, it's cold and clotted. Either way, you drink it. Or churn it. Or mix it into porridge. Meanwhile, your children are waking up. They're hungry, whiny, and already covered in dirt. No one changes their clothes either. Just a splash of water to the face, and maybe a hair comb if lice aren't too overwhelming today. They'll spend the rest of the day helping you in the fields, or trying not to die from infection. There's no coffee. No tea. No fruit, no juice, no cheerful breakfast music playing in the background. Just the sound of chewing stale bread, and distant church bells calling you to remember that your suffering is holy. Maybe, if there was a bit of leftover barley or rye mash, you might have a sip of weak ale. It's barely alcoholic, but strong enough to kill a few germs. Or maybe it gives you just enough hope to get through the next 12 hours of labor. And then, the day begins. Fields to till. Weeds to pull. Livestock to herd. All of it done hunched over, in worn-out shoes or none at all. And always in the company of dirt. Dirt on your hands, your food, your clothes, your soul. And the worst part. This was a good morning. No plague. No famine. No raiding soldiers. Just you, your aching body, your lice-ridden bed, and the slow crawl of another day in the life of a medieval peasant. Breakfast in medieval times was not so much a meal as it was a dull, flavorless pause between suffering. For the average peasant, waking up did not mean sizzling eggs or fragrant herbs. It meant bread. Just bread. Not the soft, fluffy kind that might make mornings slightly more tolerable. No. It was dense, coarse, heavy rye bread, made mostly of whatever grain hadn't been stolen by the rats or taxed by the Lord. There were no spreads. No jams. Butter was rare and often rancid. The bread came as it was, possibly hard, sometimes moldy, always dry. In fact, most medieval peasants wouldn't even chew the crust. They soaked it in water, milk, or weak ale to soften it up enough not to break their few remaining teeth. Sugar was a distant fantasy. An exotic dream from foreign lands. A peasant might live and die without ever tasting it. Honey was reserved for festivals or stolen by bears. Sweetness simply didn't exist in the breakfast lexicon. There was nothing to start your day with joy. There was only survival. Sometimes, the bread had onion in it. This was considered an event. A cause for minor celebration. Maybe a few tears, partly from joy, partly from the onion itself. But even that didn't last long. Onions were cheap but not always available, and storing them through a long winter was its own quiet disaster. Other times, if you had a bit of leftover ale from the night before, weak and sour though it was, you could dip your bread in that. This was considered both hydration and flavoring. Ale was safer than water, which was often polluted or filled with things that made your insides protest. Even children drank ale, because the choice was between mild drunkenness or parasites. The bread was made at home, or in a communal village oven, if such a thing existed. Making it was its own punishment. Grinding the grain on a hand mill took hours. The flour was coarse and filled with tiny stones that dulled teeth. The dough was kneaded by hand in a bowl that might also have been used to wash feet the day before. No one cared. Germs weren't understood. And even if they were, most peasants didn't have the luxury of being selective. And if you didn't bake your bread at home, you paid to use the Lord's oven. That meant handing over more grain. More time. More regret. Everything cost something. Even the basic act of feeding your family. Even something as joyless as bread. In particularly lean times, like after a failed harvest or during one of many recurring famines, the bread wasn't even bread anymore. It was bark. Acorns. Ground up roots. People used whatever they could grind into powder, mixed it with a bit of water or spoiled milk, and called it food. They baked it into blackened, bitter cakes that broke more than they fed. And the texture. Dry. Crumbly. Sometimes spongy from mold. Always coarse. It stuck in your teeth and turned to paste in your mouth. Eating it was not an act of enjoyment, it was a daily ritual of endurance. The body needed fuel, even if the soul felt empty. There were no plates. No utensils. People used their hands. Or wooden boards. Or sometimes nothing at all. The bread was passed around, broken off in hunks, shared among family members, who had already learned how to ignore hunger for the good of someone else. Breakfast happened quickly. There wasn't time to linger. There were cows to feed, fields to plow, fires to relight, thatching to repair, pigs to keep from wandering into the churchyard again. Eating was not an event. It was an obstacle between you and the day's suffering. Some mornings, breakfast was skipped. Not out of choice, but out of necessity. The bread had molded, or the rats had eaten it, or there simply hadn't been enough flour to make a new loaf. Those mornings were met with silence and gnawing stomachs. But they weren't unusual. They were just part of the rhythm. Children didn't complain. They learned not to. Complaining didn't make more bread appear. Parents gave what little they had to the youngest. And everyone else learned to go without. Hunger wasn't a tragedy. It was a normal part of living. And so, with dry crust in your teeth, and a faint taste of spoiled barley lingering on your tongue, you stepped into another day. Hoping the next meal might include a scrap of cheese. Or maybe a leek. But mostly knowing it would be the same. Bread. Again. The medieval peasant did not ask for variety. They asked to live. And the bread, however stale, dry, or bitter, was the only answer the world gave. Work for a medieval peasant was not something you did to pass the time, or to get ahead in life. It was simply what life was. From the moment the pale gray of dawn crept over the horizon to the time the stars emerged in the freezing sky, a peasant's day was consumed by labor. Not clever labor. Not rewarding labor. Just endless, muscle-destroying, spirit-flattening toil. Every season brought different tasks, but none of them were easier than the last. Spring meant preparing the land. Turning over frozen clumps of earth, with a heavy wooden plow, if you were lucky enough to borrow an ox. If not, you became the ox. Bent over with a hoe or spade, scraping at the soil for hours until your back stiffened and your hands blistered. Summer brought heat. And insects. And the growing panic that if you didn't weed fast enough, if you didn't keep birds away, if you didn't pray hard enough, the crops might fail. So you worked faster. Stooped low. Tearing weeds, swatting flies, wiping sweat from your face with a sleeve crusted in dust. Autumn was the harvest. The most important, exhausting, and dangerous time of the year. It was all hands in the field. Cutting, binding, gathering. The grain had to be taken in quickly before rain spoiled it, or winds blew it away. Families worked from before sunrise until after sunset. If someone got injured or fell ill, they simply kept going. Stopping was not an option. Winter was quieter, but not restful. It was the season of maintenance. Fixing tools, patching roofs, feeding animals from dwindling stores. Chopping wood until your hands bled. Hauling water through snow. Worrying about whether your turnips would last until spring. Worrying about everything, always. There were no days off. No weekends. Even church days meant waking up early, doing chores, attending mass, then getting back to work. Saints' feast days offered occasional respite, but often came with their own obligations, like preparing food you didn't have or offering gifts you couldn't afford. Rest was something you earned only when your body collapsed. The work wasn't just in the fields. It was everywhere. Thatched roofs needed fixing. Livestock wandered and had to be rounded up. Fences broke. Carts fell apart. Clay ovens cracked. Everything was always falling apart. Everything demanded attention. Children worked too. As soon as they could walk, they carried things. Pulled weeds. Watched geese. Collected firewood. If a child made it to 12 without permanent injury or illness, they were considered strong. If they lived past 5, they were considered fortunate. Women worked just as much as men. Maybe more. While men labored outside, women labored everywhere. Cooking, spinning wool, nursing children, gathering herbs, mending clothing, making candles, hauling water, and still helping in the fields when needed. Which was always. And all of this, the breaking of backs, the endless hours, the dirt under fingernails and in lungs, was for one goal: survival. You didn't work to get rich. You worked so you wouldn't starve. So your family might have something to eat tonight. So the Lord's taxes could be paid. So you wouldn't be fined or beaten. So you might make it through one more winter. Sometimes, after a full day of labor, you had nothing to show for it. The rain ruined the crops. The sheep got sick. A nobleman rode through and demanded tribute. Or the miller cheated you when you tried to grind your grain. You couldn't complain. There was no one to listen. Just more work tomorrow. There was no glory in it. No recognition. No medals or milestones. Just routine, fatigue, and the quiet erosion of hope. You worked until you were old. And in medieval times, old might mean 45. You might think of evening as a chance to rest, but that was only partially true. After working all day, you still had to feed your family. Cook something, repair things, prepare for the next day's labor. And even rest meant sleeping on straw, scratching at lice, and trying not to dream about hunger. This was work. Every day. All year. For your entire life. Not a choice. Not a career. Just the slow grind of existence for a medieval peasant. And tomorrow, it would begin again. If life as a medieval peasant was already a bleak, bone-grinding routine of cold mornings and endless labor, it was made even worse by one unchainable truth. None of it really belonged to you. Not your land. Not your tools. Not even the food you grew with your own hands. It all belonged to the Lord. And the Lord always wanted more. You could break your back from spring to harvest, tending fields, coaxing a crop from stubborn soil, only to have the best part of your yield taken as tax. This wasn't optional. It wasn't negotiable. You didn't get to say, no. The manorial system saw to that. You were bound to the land. And the land was bound to the Lord. First came the labor tax, known as corvée. You owed the Lord free labor on his own land several days a week. Even during harvest. Even when your own fields needed tending. You worked his land first. Your own crops could wait. Or die. That was your problem. Then came the in-kind taxes. A share of your grain. A portion of your chickens. Some of your eggs, your firewood, your wool. If you had bees, the Lord took honey. If your cow produced milk, you owed him cheese. If your pig had piglets, the Lord expected a few of those too. And if you wanted to use his mill, to grind your own grain that you had grown and harvested, well, you had to pay for that privilege. A portion of the flour went to the miller, who worked for the Lord. More if you couldn't argue. And most peasants couldn't. Want to bake bread? Use the Lord's oven. Pay a fee. Want to press grapes for wine? Use the Lord's press. Pay a fee. Want to collect firewood from the forest? That forest belongs to the Lord. You guessed it, pay a fee. It wasn't just your belongings that were taxed. It was your entire existence. You paid when you got married. You paid when your children were born. You paid when they died. You even paid when you died, because your family had to give your best animal to the Lord as a death duty. Peasants couldn't hunt deer or boar. That was reserved for nobility. Even poaching a rabbit could mean a fine, a whipping, or worse. So if your family was starving and you caught a hare in the woods, you'd better not get caught. Because feeding your children might mean losing your fingers. The taxes weren't always fair. Or predictable. A bad harvest didn't mean the Lord would ask for less. It meant you had to borrow. Go into debt. Pawn your tools. Sell your only warm cloak. Just to pay what was demanded. And who collected the taxes? The bailiff. A man who lived among the peasants but worked for the Lord. He knew who had what. Who might be hiding a pig. Who failed to offer a proper tithe? If you tried to hide your goods, he could come with men and take what he thought was fair. Sometimes more. Always without apology. And above the Lord was the church. Yes, even the holy men took their share. The tithe, 10% of everything, went to the local priest. Or the monastery. Supposedly for God. But often for the upkeep of buildings you weren't allowed to enter if you smelled too poor. So there you were. After working dawn to dusk. Eating dry bread. Hoping your family didn't freeze this winter. And at the end of it all, your barn was half empty because the Lord had taken his due. And the church had taken theirs. And the miller and the oven master, and the bailiff had each taken a bite. And all that was left was barely enough to last the month. You didn't complain. Or if you did it quietly. To your spouse, or to your animals, or to the sky. Because complaint wasn't rebellion. It was just one more sound lost in the endless silence of poverty. The system wasn't broken. It worked exactly as it was meant to. For the Lord. For the church. For everyone but you. And so you paid. And you paid. Until the end of your life. And then your children paid too. Because in the world of the medieval peasant, even despair was taxed. In the life of a medieval peasant, there were many masters. The Lord. The bailiff. The priest. But above them all, colder and more relentless, was the weather. It made no demands. It gave no explanations. It simply arrived. And it could undo an entire year of labor without warning. You could do everything right. Till your fields in spring. Sow seeds on time. Weed, water, pray. And then June would bring 3 weeks of rain. Or none at all. A cold snap could kill your seedlings. A warm winter could invite pests. Every success could be undone by a single afternoon of bad weather. Floods drowned barley. Hail flattened rye. Drought cracked the soil until it swallowed your seeds. Livestock died of thirst or sickness. That meant no wool. No milk. No cheese. No eggs. A single storm could mean starvation. You couldn't plan for it. You couldn't insure against it. There were no forecasts. The best you had were the sky, the wind, and the aching in your knees. Some peasants looked to omens. Birds flying low. Frogs croaking louder than usual. But mostly, you waited. And hoped. If a bad harvest came, you didn't eat less, you ate differently. You stretched stale bread with mold scraped off. Boiled leaves into soup. You picked acorns, peeled off the bitter skins, and ground them into flour. You ate whatever was left in the bottom of a grain sack. Even if it had worms. During the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, the weather was especially cruel. Rain fell for months. Crops rotted in the ground. Animals died in mud. People ate bark. Grass. There were stories, dark, hushed ones, about families doing worse. No one talked about it. But everyone knew. Even when the weather was average, it was never kind. Winters froze your feet. Summers scorched your neck. Spring teased you with warmth before unleashing another frost. There was no shelter. Your hut had no insulation. Your clothes were patched and thin. Your shoes, if you had them, leaked. Sickness came with the seasons. Coughs in winter. Fevers in summer. Malnutrition made everything worse. The weather didn't just affect the fields. It affected your body. Your children's bodies. A wet autumn could mean a deadly spring. But still, you rose every morning. Looked at the sky. Felt the wind. Prayed the weather would hold. And when it didn't, you clenched your jaw and worked anyway. Because you had no choice. Because no one was coming to help. Because this was your life. When storms rolled in and thunder cracked, you didn't find it dramatic. You found it exhausting. Every storm was another subtraction. Another meal lost. Another set of footprints washed away from your path to survival. And still the taxes came. Still the tithe. Still the work on the Lord's land. Whether the sky smiled or wept, the expectations never changed. Only your stomach did. Only your stores. Only the thin, pale face of your child, asking if there would be more food tomorrow. The weather was not a season. It was a sentence. Handed down without cause. Without mercy. And you served it year after year. Hoping for a mild summer. A dry harvest. A winter that didn't kill. But the sky didn't care. It never had. It never would. There is a kind of hunger that lives in your bones. Not the sharp pang of skipping a single meal. But the deep, slow ache of knowing that every day will be just like the one before. That your next meal is already known. And it will not be enough. For the medieval peasant, food was never a feast. It was a duty. It was fuel. And it was almost always brown. You started with bread. Always bread. Coarse, dark, heavy loaves made from rye or barley. If it wasn't moldy, it was stale. If it wasn't stale, it was rare. Wheat bread was for the rich. You didn't even dream of it. You couldn't afford to. With your bread, you might have some pottage. A thin, vegetable stew that was more water than anything else. Made with leeks, cabbage, onions, and wild herbs you gathered from the edge of the woods. If you were lucky, maybe a turnip. If you were very lucky, a tiny scrap of bacon fat to add flavor. There were no spices. Salt was expensive. Pepper was a fantasy. Your stew tasted like boiled sadness. And it looked just as gray. On special days, which were few, you might get dairy. A bit of milk from your cow, if it hadn't dried up. A lump of cheese, hard and sharp. Maybe some butter, but that was rare. Most of the milk went to the Lord anyway. Eggs were a treat, not a staple. Chickens were more valuable alive. Eating eggs meant fewer chicks. Fewer chicks meant fewer future meals. Everything was a calculation. Eat today, or save for tomorrow. Meat was almost mythical. A rabbit if you poached. A chicken on a saint's day. A pig once a year, maybe, if your family raised one. And when that pig was slaughtered, every single part was used. The fat, the bones, the intestines. Nothing was wasted. You couldn't eat fish unless you lived near a river. And even then, the Lord often claimed fishing rights. If you were caught fishing, you could be fined. Or worse. So you boiled weeds and called it soup. You chewed bark for flavor. Fruit was seasonal. Apples in autumn. Berries in summer. But there were no sweet sauces. No sugar to sprinkle on top. Just the plain, hard flesh of a windfall apple, bruised and tart. In winter, food was stored in pits or barrels. Pickled. Smoked. Or dried. Everything tasted like damp earth or fire. Meals were repetitive. Predictable. And dull. But not eating was worse. Water was often unsafe. So peasants drank ale. Weak, sour, and brewed in the village. It didn't lift spirits. It dulled them. And made the hunger feel farther away. Holidays were the only time you saw variety. Communal feasts. Shared food. Maybe a roasted goose. Maybe a pie. But these were rare. Maybe once or twice a year. Enough to remember what fullness felt like. Just long enough to miss it when it was gone. You didn't eat for pleasure. You ate to survive. Food wasn't chosen. It was accepted. There was no menu. Only what the land and the sky permitted. A peasant's meal did not nourish the soul. It barely sustained the body. But you chewed. You swallowed. You worked. And when the bread was gone, you scraped the bowl clean. Just in case a taste of yesterday had been left behind. If you think modern mud is bad, imagine medieval mud. It wasn't just dirt. It was everything mixed together. Animal waste. Human waste. Rotting food. And rain. The streets of a peasant village weren't paved. There were no sewers. Waste was tossed into the street or into ditches that ran alongside houses. When it rained, everything mixed into a foul, sticky sludge. Flies loved this. They swarmed everywhere. They fed on the filth and landed on food. They carried disease. But no one had the luxury of worrying about germs. Survival came first. Bathing was a rarity. Water was precious. The same water you drank was often used to wash. Some peasants bathed only once or twice a year. When the priest came for a visit or before a festival. Soap was a luxury. Usually made from animal fat mixed with ashes. It smelled worse than the grime it was supposed to remove. Clothes were washed rarely. Sometimes the same garment was worn for months. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were constant companions. They lived in your hair, your clothes, your bed. Scratching was endless. It was normal to have sores from biting insects. The smell of a village was a thick, sour cloud, mixed with smoke from fires used for cooking and warmth. It was everywhere. You couldn't escape it. But this wasn't just unpleasant. It was deadly. Poor hygiene helped spread disease. Plague, dysentery, typhoid, and worse. When illness came, it could wipe out entire families, leaving children orphaned and land untended. Still, the peasant lived with it. The filth, the flies, the smell. Because the alternative was starvation. Because there was nowhere else to go. So, you woke each day covered in grime. You worked until your clothes stuck to your skin. You slept in straw filled with lice. And you hoped tomorrow would be just a little less filthy. Imagine working from the moment the sun rises until it disappears below the horizon. You plant the seeds, tend the stubborn crops, pull the weeds, and finally harvest what you hope will be enough to keep your family fed through the bitter winter. But once the hard work is done, your bounty doesn't belong to you. It belongs to others, the lord of the manor, the church, and the king, who all claim their share before you see a single crumb. This relentless cycle of giving away the fruits of your labor leaves little for yourself, your family, or your future. The medieval tax system was brutal and unforgiving. Taxes weren't just about money, they came in the form of grain, animals, and forced labor. The tithe was one of the most despised levies, a mandatory payment to the church taking exactly 1/10 of everything you produced. Whether your fields yielded a plentiful harvest, or barely enough to survive, you still had to give up this portion. The local priest was waiting, and no exceptions were made. This tax drained the peasant stores, making it even harder to get through lean times. Beyond the church demands were the manorial dues. You had to pay fees just to use the Lord's mill to grind your grain into flour, a process essential for making bread. The Lord's oven was another source of charges, where you were fined for baking your bread. Even your livestock came with strings attached. Letting animals roam freely could earn you fines that tightened the noose of poverty. If you wanted to marry or inherit land, you paid for that privilege. Falling ill didn't grant you a break either, the debts piled up regardless of misfortune. Then there was corvée labor, days when peasants were forced to leave their own fields and work unpaid on the Lord's lands or construction projects. The backbreaking manual labor stretched your body and spirit thin, with no reward but the bare chance to keep your home. No matter how hard you worked, the system ensured the Lord grew wealthier, while your family remained trapped in poverty and hunger. Resistance was dangerous. Peasants who refused to pay or tried to withhold taxes risked brutal punishment, fines, or eviction. This cycle of exploitation kept peasants under the thumb of the ruling class, living lives defined by struggle and loss. The very land they worked on was never truly theirs. The bitter truth was clear, the medieval peasant's life was a slow surrender. Endless toil, heavy taxes, and tithes meant that no matter how hard they worked, the spoils were never theirs to keep. Regret seeped into every furrowed field and every empty plate. They labored so others could thrive, all while they scraped to survive another day. Every day for a medieval peasant was a battle against exhaustion. From dawn until dusk, there was no rest, only constant labor. Fields needed plowing, seeds had to be sown just right, weeds pulled, and crops harvested, all by hand, with crude tools that required every ounce of strength to wield. There was no machinery, no shortcuts, only back-breaking work that bent your body and wore down your spirit. The work was unending and unforgiving. In the spring, peasants prepared the soil, struggling with heavy wooden plows pulled by oxen, which were slow and often broke down. Summer meant endless, tending, watering, weeding, and protecting crops from pests and weather that could destroy months of effort overnight. Autumn was the cruelest. Harvest time demanded long hours under the fading sun to gather in the grain before it spoiled. And in winter, while the fields lay barren and cold, peasants still had chores, tending animals, repairing tools and buildings, and preparing for the next cycle of misery. There was no vacation, no days off, and no promise of reward. The work was physically exhausting and often painful. Injuries were common: cuts, blisters, broken bones, and medical help was a luxury few could afford. Illness meant missed work, and missed work meant hunger. The relentless toil drained not only the body, but the hope that things could ever improve. Women, children, and the elderly were not spared either. Women worked in the fields alongside men, cooked, cleaned, cared for children, and spun wool late into the night. Children were put to work as soon as they were able, carrying water, gathering firewood, helping with planting and harvesting. Old or sick peasants were often a burden, as there was little to no social safety net. The endless cycle of labor created a life that was physically grueling and emotionally crushing. Few peasants lived long enough to see their grandchildren grow, worn down by a lifetime of struggle. Every day was a test of endurance, and every night brought little comfort from the aches and worries of the day. In the end, it was a life built on toil with no escape, where bodies broke, spirits dimmed, and dreams of something better faded into the dirt they labored in. Life as a medieval peasant was nothing short of relentless labor. From the moment dawn's first light crept over the horizon, the peasant was already on their feet, thrust into a world where every minute was consumed by work, and every action was a struggle for survival. The fields that surrounded their modest huts were both their livelihood and their prison. With crude wooden plows, often pulled by slow, stubborn oxen, the peasant had to till the unforgiving soil. These plows were primitive and required immense physical strength to guide, often breaking under the strain and forcing the peasant to stop and repair them with limited tools and resources. The dirt was heavy and unyielding, and the weather was never a friend. When rain fell too hard, fields became mud traps, making progress agonizingly slow. When the sun beat down mercilessly, dehydration and exhaustion followed swiftly. Spring and summer were seasons of desperate vigilance and ceaseless work. Seeds had to be planted with precision. Too shallow and they'd dry up, too deep and they wouldn't sprout. Weeds had to be pulled by hand to prevent them from choking the crops, and pests like locusts or birds threatened to devour months of toil in moments. Any failure meant starvation, so peasants worked with anxious urgency. Harvest was the ultimate test. 4 weeks, from dawn until dusk, peasants reaped grain, fruits, and vegetables using sickles and scythes, tools that demanded skill and strength to wield. Their fingers bled, backs ached, and muscles screamed, but stopping meant losing the harvest to rot or theft. It was a race against time and nature, and failure was not an option. When winter arrived, the fields lay fallow and barren, but the peasants' work was far from over. They spent the cold months mending tools, repairing thatched roofs, chopping firewood, and tending to animals in freezing stables. Despite the snow and ice, daily chores went on, and hunger gnawed as food stores dwindled. The weight of relentless labor was not only physical but mental. The peasant knew there was no relief from the cycle, no rest from the toil. Illness and injury were constant threats. Medical knowledge was scarce, and treatments were rudimentary at best. A cut might fester into a deadly infection. A twisted ankle could mean weeks of lost labor and starvation. Yet there was no safety net. Family members had to cover for the sick or injured, multiplying the hardship. The burden fell on everyone, including women and children. Women balanced field work with household chores, cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, caring for children, often working late into the night by the flicker of a fire. Children were pressed into service as soon as they were able, carrying water, gathering kindling, or helping in the fields. Old age was rare, and if reached, was often marked by weakness and dependence on younger family members. The emotional toll was profound. Dreams of a better life faded under the weight of daily survival. The knowledge that, no matter how hard they worked, the fruits of their labor were largely claimed by taxes, dues, and the needs of the Lord and Church, cast a shadow over every effort. Each day was a battle to keep the family fed, clothed, and sheltered, with little hope of ever improving their lot. This endless, exhausting labor shaped the very essence of medieval peasant life, a world where bodies were worn down, spirits broken, and dreams dimmed beneath the dirt and toil of centuries-old fields. There was no escape, no respite, only the daily grind that chained peasants to a life of hardship, struggle, and regret. For the medieval peasant, food was a daily reminder of hardship rather than comfort or joy. The diet was starkly simple, repetitive, and often barely enough to keep hunger at bay. Meals were dominated by coarse rye or barley bread, which was dense, heavy, and sometimes stale by the time it reached the table. The peasants had no sugar, no spices, no coffee or tea, just bland, earthy flavors that filled their bellies but did little to satisfy the soul. Their food was fuel, not a pleasure. Breakfast was usually the lightest meal of the day, and often consisted of a piece of hard bread soaked in cold ale or water. The ale was weak, barely fermented, but safer to drink than often contaminated water sources. Occasionally, if they were lucky, a handful of onions or some wild herbs would add a bit of flavor. But for most peasants, variety was a luxury they could not afford. The monotony of bread day after day weighed heavily, especially during the lean seasons, when crops failed or food stores ran low. The main meal of the day, usually eaten around midday, was a thin pottage or stew made from whatever vegetables or grains were available. This watery porridge might include beans, peas, cabbage, leeks, or wild greens, simmered slowly to extract every bit of nourishment. Meat was a rare treat, often reserved for special occasions like feast days, harvest celebrations, or church festivals. Hunting was strictly forbidden for peasants, and livestock was scarce, typically kept for milk or eggs rather than slaughter. Fish was sometimes available, particularly in coastal or riverside communities, but often had to be salted or dried to last through winter. Seasonal shortages meant that winter was especially brutal. Stored grains and root vegetables dwindled, and hunger became a constant companion. Starvation was a real and terrifying threat, particularly during bad harvest years or times of famine. The peasant's diet during these times was barely enough to sustain life: thin gruels and stale bread that did little to stave off weakness or disease. Malnutrition was widespread, weakening immune systems and making peasants more vulnerable to illness and early death. Drinking water was often contaminated, but peasants had few alternatives. Ale and cider were safer, but weak and low in alcohol content compared to modern beverages. Meals were taken quickly, eaten standing or sitting on rough benches, without the comfort of utensils or clean dishes. Sharing food with family and neighbors was common, but even then, portions were small and barely satisfying. In short, the medieval peasant diet was a bleak cycle of scarcity and repetition. It was a diet that kept people alive but robbed them of pleasure, nutrition, and energy. Every meal was a reminder of poverty, a struggle against hunger, and a harsh testament to the grim reality of peasant life. Medieval peasants lived in a world riddled with filth and disease, a harsh environment that bred suffering on an almost unimaginable scale. Theirs was not just a life of back-breaking labor and meager food, but also constant exposure to dirt, parasites, and deadly illnesses. Sanitation was virtually non-existent. Waste from humans and animals alike contaminated the very soil they worked and the water they drank. Open cesspits and communal latrines were often little more than pits filled with raw sewage, attracting flies and vermin that spread infections rapidly. Streets, if they could even be called that, were often muddy and littered with refuse, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. Peasants slept on beds of straw, which were infested with lice, fleas, and bedbugs. These parasites caused relentless itching, skin infections, and were vectors for diseases such as typhus and plague. Bathing was a rare luxury. Most peasants went days, weeks, or even months without washing properly, both because of the cold and because water sources were scarce and often contaminated. The idea of personal hygiene as we know it today simply did not exist, and this lack of cleanliness made peasants highly vulnerable to skin diseases, infections, and infestations. Disease struck frequently and without mercy. Common ailments like dysentery, pneumonia, tuberculosis, and influenza ravaged communities. Epidemics of more deadly diseases such as the bubonic plague swept through villages, killing large portions of the population in a matter of weeks. The Black Death of the 14th century was particularly devastating, wiping out an estimated one-third to one-half of Europe's population. Peasants, crowded into close quarters and weakened by malnutrition, were easy prey for such epidemics. Medical knowledge was primitive and largely ineffective. Most peasants had no access to physicians or hospitals. Instead, they relied on local healers, herbal remedies, and sometimes superstition or religious prayers. Treatments were often painful and ineffective: bloodletting, the use of poultices, or the application of strange concoctions with little scientific basis. Infections that might be cured today were often fatal. The fear of illness was constant, and death was a daily reality. Pregnancy and childbirth posed extreme dangers to women. High maternal mortality rates meant that many women never survived childbirth, and infant mortality was even higher. Without proper nutrition or medical care, the survival of both mother and child was precarious at best. These losses added to the crushing despair that defined peasant life. The psychological weight of living in such conditions cannot be overstated. Fear of disease, coupled with the grinding poverty and constant labor, left peasants with little hope. Many turned to religion, seeking solace in prayers and rituals as a way to cope with the relentless hardships. Still, the cycles of disease and death continued, robbing communities of their strength and future. In essence, the peasants' health crisis was a cruel combination of filth, famine, and fatal disease. It was a world where survival was never guaranteed, and the grave was often just a few days' illness away. This bleak reality shaped every aspect of medieval peasant existence, intertwining physical suffering with emotional despair, and cementing their place at the bottom of the social hierarchy. Life for a medieval peasant was never truly their own. Beyond the daily struggles of survival, peasants lived under the ever-watchful eye of their lord and his court, a presence that governed almost every aspect of their existence. The manor lord was the ultimate authority in the village, wielding power over land, justice, and the very freedoms of the peasants. His court was not just a place of administration but also a symbol of control and dominance. The peasants owed more than just their labor to the lord. They paid heavy taxes, often in the form of a share of their harvest, livestock, or goods. These dues were relentless and left peasants with just enough to survive, if that. Failure to meet obligations could result in harsh punishments, fines, additional labor, or even imprisonment. Lords and their stewards regularly held court sessions, where disputes were settled and peasants were judged, often with little fairness or mercy. Justice was a tool of power. Peasants accused of crimes, whether real or imagined, faced brutal punishments that ranged from fines to physical penalties like flogging or the stocks. The lord's court was far from impartial. It was designed to maintain order and ensure the peasants remained subservient. Even minor infractions were met with disproportionate consequences, reinforcing the gap between the powerful and the powerless. The presence of bailiffs and reeves, officials appointed by the lord, meant that peasants were constantly monitored. These men collected taxes, enforced laws, and made sure peasants toiled as expected. The threat of inspection or punishment was a constant shadow over daily life. Peasants could not simply decide how to use the land they worked. Everything belonged to the lord, and peasants were tenants with few rights. This system left little room for autonomy or hope. Peasants were trapped in a cycle of servitude, burdened not only by physical toil but by the mental strain of subjugation. Their lives revolved around the needs and whims of their lord, with little say or control over their own futures. The court was a reminder that they existed not as free individuals, but as property tied to the land and the lord's authority. At times, the court served as a grim social arena, where peasants witnessed public punishments or disputes, reinforcing social hierarchies and the lord's dominance. These events were often terrifying, but also a way to instill fear and obedience among the population. Peasants knew their place, and stepping outside the rigid social order risked severe consequences. In all, the lord's court was not just a seat of power but a symbol of the peasants' lack of freedom. It represented a system designed to extract labor and resources while keeping peasants in a permanent state of dependence and subjugation. The presence of constant surveillance, harsh justice, and unyielding taxes meant that peasants lived under a regime of control that left little room for hope, much less rebellion. For the medieval peasant, taxes and rents were a crushing weight that defined nearly every moment of their lives. Far from the modern idea of a small percentage of income, these obligations were often enormous, consuming a significant portion of their meager earnings and produce. Peasants paid rent not in money, but mostly in labor, goods, and a share of their harvest, a system that left them with barely enough to sustain themselves and their families. Rents were paid to the lord of the manor, who owned the land the peasants worked. This rent could take many forms: a portion of the grain, vegetables, or livestock raised, a fixed number of days spent working the lord's fields, or various fees for using the lord's mill, oven, or wine press. Each obligation chipped away at the peasant's ability to survive, turning every season into a race against scarcity. Taxes compounded this burden. In addition to rents, peasants were often required to pay taxes to the crown, church, and local authorities. The tithe, a mandatory payment of 1/10 of a family's produce or earnings to the church, was a particularly heavy tax. Failure to pay could mean excommunication or worse, which meant social and spiritual ruin for a deeply religious population. Moreover, special levies or extraordinary taxes were sometimes imposed to fund wars, royal projects, or local lordly extravagances. These unexpected demands could push peasants to the brink of destitution. It was not uncommon for peasants to borrow from moneylenders at high interest rates just to meet tax demands, plunging families into cycles of debt that lasted generations. This constant drain on resources meant that peasants rarely had surplus food or wealth. Their own needs often came last, leading to hunger, malnutrition, and an inability to invest in improving their land or homes. The psychological toll of this economic pressure was immense: the relentless worry over whether the next harvest would be enough, or if the taxes would leave them homeless or imprisoned. The system was designed to keep peasants dependent and powerless. Lords needed their peasants to work the land, but they also demanded obedience and tribute in return. The peasants' labor fueled the wealth of the aristocracy while trapping them in a cycle of poverty and subjugation. The crushing burden of taxes and rents was more than just an economic hardship; it was a tool of control and suppression that defined medieval peasant life. The living conditions of medieval peasants were nothing short of brutal: a daily battle against filth, overcrowding, and the constant threat of disease. Most peasants lived in tiny, single-room huts made of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that offered minimal protection against the elements. These huts were dark, damp, and drafty, often with dirt floors that turned to mud during rainy seasons. Families, sometimes including multiple generations, crowded into these small spaces with barely enough room to move. Sanitation was practically non-existent. Human and animal waste was often dumped just outside the homes or in shallow pits, which contaminated the water and soil. The proximity of animals like pigs, chickens, and cows added to the mess and the stench. Flies and rodents thrived in this environment, spreading bacteria and disease with ease. Peasants had little choice but to endure these conditions, as there was no alternative housing, and no system to manage waste or clean streets. Overcrowding was another serious problem. Villages were tightly packed, with huts crammed together in small clusters. The lack of personal space contributed to the rapid spread of contagious diseases, including respiratory infections and skin conditions. Privacy was almost non-existent, and the close quarters meant that illness in one family often quickly spread to neighbors. Water sources were limited and often contaminated. Wells and streams could be polluted by runoff from fields and waste pits, making clean drinking water a precious and rare commodity. This contamination contributed to frequent outbreaks of waterborne diseases like dysentery and cholera, which claimed many lives. The cycle of disease, malnutrition, and poverty was vicious and hard to break. Heat and cold added to the misery. In winter, the single small hearth was the only source of warmth, and its smoke often filled the cramped hut, making breathing difficult. Peasants had few clothes and no insulation to protect against freezing temperatures, which led to illness and hardship during the cold months. In summer, the lack of ventilation turned homes into stifling, sweaty chambers where disease could thrive. The physical environment itself was hostile. Muddy, uneven paths connected huts and fields, turning into quagmires in the rain and making travel difficult and unpleasant. The land was often overworked and poorly drained, exacerbating the problems of poor hygiene and disease. All these factors combined to make peasant life a constant struggle against dirt and illness. Ultimately, the harsh living conditions were a reflection of the social hierarchy and economic system that kept peasants at the bottom. Their homes and villages were places of hardship, not comfort, where survival depended on endurance more than hope. The dirt, crowds, and disease were not just unfortunate circumstances, but symptoms of a system designed to exploit and oppress. For the medieval peasant, life was defined by relentless, grueling labor that stretched from the first light of dawn until the last faint glow of dusk. Unlike today's concept of work-life balance, there was no respite or weekends, just a constant grind dictated by the seasons, weather, and the demands of survival. Every day was a struggle against exhaustion, with the burden of both subsistence farming and fulfilling the Lord's obligations weighing heavily on the peasant's shoulders. The typical workday began before sunrise, often with a rude awakening by the village roosters, or the bitter cold. After a quick, meager breakfast, peasants headed straight to the fields, where they engaged in backbreaking tasks like plowing, sowing, weeding, and harvesting. These tasks required immense physical strength and endurance, especially given the primitive tools available: wooden plows, crude hoes, and sickles that demanded skill but offered little efficiency. Weather conditions rarely permitted breaks. Peasants worked through rain, scorching heat, and biting cold, knowing that failure to tend the land meant starvation. Beyond their own plots, peasants were also required to work the Lord's demesne, the portion of land directly controlled by the manor. This meant additional unpaid labor, often several days a week, to maintain the Lord's fields, repair fences, clear forests, and perform other menial tasks. The demands of this corvée labor left peasants exhausted and with little time to cultivate their own subsistence crops. It was a constant tug of war between survival and servitude. Children were not exempt. From a young age, boys and girls were expected to contribute, tending animals, fetching water, gathering firewood, or helping in the fields. Their childhood was short, replaced by an early induction into the hard realities of peasant life. Even the elderly, if able, were drawn into the labor cycle, as every hand counted in a world where failure could mean death. Seasonal cycles shaped the rhythm of work. Spring and summer were dominated by planting and tending crops, while autumn was harvest time, a race against time and weather to gather food before winter. Winter brought some relief from the fields, but it was far from restful. Peasants had to repair tools, mend fences, prepare food stores, and manage animals in harsh conditions, all while battling cold and hunger. The physical toll was enormous. Chronic pain, malnutrition, and injuries were common, yet peasants had little access to medical care or time for recovery. Work was not just a necessity, it was a sentence. The endless labor defined the peasant's identity and existence, leaving little space for rest, pleasure, or hope. In this harsh reality, the medieval peasant was caught in a brutal cycle: work to survive, but work that ensured continued hardship. The life of dirt, taxes, and regret was one of unceasing toil, marked by exhaustion and the constant shadow of failure. For the medieval peasant, food was a daily struggle rather than a comfort or joy. Their diet was monotonous, centered largely on whatever grains they could grow and bake into coarse bread, supplemented only occasionally by vegetables, legumes, or the rare piece of meat or fish. Hunger was an ever-present companion, intensified by the harsh realities of poor harvests, bad weather, and the demands of taxes that often took much of their produce before they could eat. The staple was typically rye, or barley bread, dense and hard, eaten almost every meal. Peasants had no access to the variety or spices enjoyed by the wealthy: no sugar, no salt, no imported delicacies. Soups and pottages made from vegetables and grains provided some variation but were thin and unappetizing. Meat was a luxury, mostly reserved for feast days or special occasions, and even then only the lord or wealthy could afford it regularly. Famine was a brutal reality. Crop failures due to drought, floods, pests, or early frosts could decimate the harvest, leaving peasants with little to no food reserves. When famine struck, starvation became widespread, and malnutrition weakened the population, making them more vulnerable to disease. Stories of entire villages perishing were not uncommon, and peasants lived with the constant fear that the next season's harvest might fail again. Food scarcity was compounded by the demands of taxes and rents. Much of what peasants produced was claimed by the lord, the church, or local authorities, leaving only scraps for the family. This systemic extraction ensured that peasants rarely accumulated enough surplus food to survive bad years, trapping them in a cycle of scarcity. Hunger affected more than just the body. It impacted the mental and emotional state of peasants, fostering despair, irritability, and hopelessness. Parents worried about their children's survival, and children grew up accustomed to the gnawing emptiness of hunger. The lack of adequate nutrition also stunted growth and development, leaving generations physically weakened. In some cases, peasants resorted to desperate measures, foraging wild plants, eating roots, or scavenging leftovers. These foods were often unpalatable or even harmful, but hunger forced acceptance. The grim reality of famine was a testament to the harshness of medieval peasant life, and the fragile balance between survival and starvation. Ultimately, the constant hunger of peasants was not just a failure of agriculture but a symptom of the broader social and economic system. The cycle of food scarcity, taxation, and labor exploitation ensured that peasants remained trapped in poverty, struggling to survive in a world that offered little mercy. Medieval peasants had few options when it came to clothing, and what they did wear reflected the harsh realities of their lives. Their garments were simple, made from coarse and wool or rough linen that was scratchy and uncomfortable. Fine fabrics like silk or brightly colored cloth were reserved for the wealthy elite, and peasants' clothes were often hand-me-downs or homemade from whatever materials they could scavenge. Because clothes were expensive and difficult to replace, peasants wore the same garments for years, patching holes with scraps and enduring the discomfort of worn fabric. Their shoes, if they had any, were basic leather or wooden clogs that offered little protection from mud and cold. Many peasants, especially children, went barefoot for much of the year, exposing themselves to injuries, infections, and the filth of the village paths. Washing clothes was a laborious task that peasants could only do occasionally. Without access to modern detergents or washing machines, they used river water, ash, or homemade lye soap, which was harsh and damaged fabric. Clothes rarely dried quickly, especially during wet or cold seasons, so peasants often wore damp garments that caused discomfort and health issues. Personal hygiene was equally neglected, not out of choice but necessity. Baths were infrequent, sometimes only a few times a year, due to the scarcity of clean water and the labor required to heat it. Instead, peasants might rely on washing their hands and faces with cold water or using herbal rinses. This lack of regular washing led to a buildup of dirt, sweat, and body odor that was part and parcel of peasant life. Another common issue was lice and fleas, which thrived in the unwashed, crowded living conditions. These pests caused itching, irritation, and could spread diseases, adding to the misery. Peasants had little means to control infestations, often relying on crude combs or herbal remedies that offered limited relief. The combination of ragged clothing and poor cleanliness affected social status and daily interactions. Peasants were visibly marked as lower class by their appearance, which reinforced their place in the medieval social hierarchy. It was a harsh reality, where physical grime mirrored social and economic hardship. In sum, medieval peasants were trapped in a cycle where their environment, poverty, and hard labor made it nearly impossible to maintain cleanliness or decent clothing. This added another layer of discomfort and degradation to an already difficult life, making the phrase, dirt, taxes, and regret, all too fitting. Religion played a profound role in the life of the medieval peasant, shaping their worldview, daily routines, and social order. The church was not only a spiritual authority but also a powerful institution that permeated every aspect of peasant existence. For many peasants, religion provided a source of comfort amid hardship, offering hope for a better life after death and a framework to make sense of suffering and misfortune. However, this spiritual solace came with a heavy dose of control. The church reinforced the existing social hierarchy, teaching that peasants' low status was divinely ordained, and that obedience to earthly lords and God was a moral duty. Sermons often emphasized humility, acceptance, and the virtue of enduring suffering patiently, which discouraged rebellion or demands for change. In this way, religion acted as both a balm and a tool for maintaining the status quo. Peasants' lives were punctuated by religious festivals, holy days, and rituals that offered rare moments of relief from labor. These events brought communities together for feasts, dancing, and celebration, temporarily lifting spirits and reinforcing social bonds. Yet, even these festivities were tied to the church's calendar and authority, keeping peasants spiritually and socially connected to the institution that governed much of their lives. The church also imposed tithes, taxes paid in kind or money, that further burdened peasants already struggling with heavy secular taxes. This religious taxation was a constant reminder of the church's power, and the peasants' dependence on both spiritual and temporal authorities. Failure to pay tithes could result in harsh penalties, including excommunication, which threatened peasants with eternal damnation and social ostracism. Religious instruction and education were limited for peasants, most of whom were illiterate, and relied on priests and clergy for spiritual guidance. This dependence reinforced the clergy's authority, and the gap between the educated elite and the rural poor. At the same time, many peasants embraced their faith sincerely, finding personal meaning in prayer, pilgrimage, and devotion despite the church's role in their oppression. In some cases, peasants used religion as a subtle form of resistance or hope. Saints, miracles, and folk beliefs offered alternative narratives that could challenge official doctrine or provide comfort outside church control. Popular festivals sometimes included elements of pre-Christian traditions, blending faith with local customs. Ultimately, religion was a complex and double-edged aspect of medieval peasant life. It provided both a spiritual refuge from the relentless hardships of dirt, taxes, and regret and a system that reinforced the social order, keeping peasants bound to their struggles. Understanding this dual role helps us grasp the full picture of what it meant to be a peasant in medieval times, trapped in a world where faith was both hope and harness. In medieval society, the life of a peasant was dominated not only by relentless labor and scarcity but also by the crushing burden of taxes and feudal dues. These financial and labor obligations were the very mechanisms that sustained the medieval social and economic order, yet they left peasants perpetually struggling to keep even the barest necessities for themselves and their families. To understand the depth of a peasant's hardship, it's essential to delve into the complex system of taxation and feudal dues that dictated their existence, revealing a world where every grain of harvest, every animal, and even personal freedoms came at a price. At the heart of the medieval system stood feudalism, a hierarchical structure based on land ownership, loyalty, and service. The king granted large swaths of land to nobles, who in turn parceled out smaller plots to knights and vassals. At the very bottom of this pyramid were the peasants, who worked the land but owned none of it. The land belonged to the lord of the manor, and peasants held their plots only through obligation and servitude. This meant that peasants did not just toil for their own survival, but were required to provide a significant share of their produce, labor, and sometimes money to their lord. Feudal dues took many forms, ranging from labor services to monetary payments, and peasants had little choice but to comply. One of the most common obligations was the corvée labor, where peasants had to work on the lord's demesne, the part of the manor's land reserved for the lord's personal use, for several days each week. This unpaid labor was physically demanding, and reduced the time peasants had to work their own plots, directly impacting their food supply and income. Besides corvée, peasants owed censuses or rent payments, which might be paid in money, produce, or livestock. These rents were a fixed amount, often due quarterly or annually, and were non-negotiable. Failing to pay rent could result in eviction or harsher penalties, leaving peasants with no security or ownership of the land they depended on. Another crucial feudal obligation was the heriot, a payment made to the lord upon the death of a peasant, usually the best animal or piece of property. This system deprived peasant families of their last means of livelihood just when they were most vulnerable. The heriot reinforced the idea that peasants and their belongings ultimately belonged to the lord, not themselves. In addition to feudal dues owed directly to the lord, peasants also faced taxation from the crown and the church. The crown imposed various taxes such as the tallage, a tax levied on towns and villages at the king's discretion, and scutage, a payment made in lieu of military service. Although peasants typically did not serve in the army, scutage often trickled down as an extra financial burden on the villages. The church, wielding enormous power during medieval times, demanded a tithe, a mandatory tax of 1/10 of a peasant's produce or income paid annually. This tax was meant to support the local parish and the wider church hierarchy, but for peasants already stretched thin, it was another severe blow. Failure to pay tithes could result in excommunication, a terrifying prospect that threatened eternal damnation and social exclusion. The complexity of these taxes and dues meant that peasants often faced multiple, overlapping demands, each squeezing a share from their already meager resources. In some cases, peasants might owe dues to several lords or religious institutions at once, particularly if the manor's ownership was fragmented or the village lay near territorial borders. This patchwork of obligations was confusing, oppressive, and nearly impossible to escape. Furthermore, peasants had to pay customary fines and fees that arose from the lord's courts and local governance. For example, if a peasant wanted to marry, inherit land, or transfer property, they might have to pay a fee called relief. If they used the lord's mill, oven, or winepress, they were charged fees known as merchant or banalities. These compulsory payments further reduced peasants' ability to improve their living conditions. The economic pressure from these many dues and taxes had profound social consequences. Peasants lived in constant fear of debt and punishment, often forced to borrow or sell goods to meet their obligations. The resulting debt cycle trapped families in perpetual poverty and dependence on their lord's goodwill. Unlike free peasants or tenants at will, serfs had virtually no freedom to leave or seek better opportunities, tying them to the land and the lord indefinitely. The feudal system's rigidity meant that peasants' attempts to resist or negotiate better terms were rare, and usually met with harsh reprisals. Rebellions, when they occurred, were brutally suppressed, reinforcing the power imbalance between lord and serf. Peasants had little political voice or legal protection, and their lives were subject to the whims of local authorities. Even during times of relative prosperity, peasants' share of the harvest and income remained paltry. Most of the food produced was claimed by the lord, leaving peasants with barely enough to feed themselves and their families. This scarcity was aggravated during bad harvests, famines, or disease outbreaks, which periodically devastated medieval Europe. The burden of taxation was not only economic but also psychological. Knowing that no matter how hard they worked, a large portion of their efforts and produce would be taken away bred a sense of hopelessness and resentment. Peasants' dreams of improving their situation, owning land outright, or escaping the cycle of poverty, were crushed by the relentless demands of taxes and dues. This system also influenced peasant family life. Children were often sent to work early to help meet obligations, and families had to strategize how to maximize production while reserving enough to pay dues. Marriages could be delayed or arranged to benefit the family economically, ensuring that land or wealth stayed within manageable limits. The constant pressure limited social mobility and kept the peasantry locked into their class for generations. Despite these hardships, some peasants managed small acts of resistance or negotiation. They might collectively delay payments, appeal to higher authorities, or use local customs to reduce dues. In rare cases, they bought their freedom or acquired land through careful savings and negotiation. But these instances were exceptions rather than the norm. In the grand picture, medieval taxation and feudal dues formed a crushing system of extraction that maintained the social hierarchy at the expense of peasant well-being. The repeated cycle of hard labor, heavy taxation, and scarce returns left peasants with little but dirt, taxes, and regret. Their economic exploitation was foundational to the medieval order, but came at an immense human cost. Understanding this system reveals the harsh truth about medieval peasant life. It was a life where survival was a constant battle against both nature and man-made structures designed to keep them oppressed. The legacy of this system echoes in history as a reminder of the grinding poverty and injustice faced by the vast majority of medieval Europeans. For the medieval peasant, life was defined by relentless labor that began with the first light of dawn and often stretched long past sunset. Unlike the modern notion of work as a structured part of life, for peasants, work was life, a continuous struggle to wrest sustenance from the unforgiving land, fulfill obligations to their lord, and survive the harsh realities of medieval existence. This section delves deeply into the exhausting daily toil of peasants, revealing a world where rest was a luxury, and every hour was claimed by sweat and soil. The rhythm of a peasant's day was dictated by the seasons and the demands of agriculture. From spring planting to autumn harvest, the calendar was a cycle of preparation, work, and repair, with little room for respite. Winter brought shorter days and harsh weather, but even then, peasants had chores like tending animals, repairing tools, or preparing firewood. In every season, the natural world set a brutal pace, and peasants had to adapt or perish. Morning typically began before sunrise. Roosters crowing were an alarm clock that could not be ignored, even in the depths of winter. After a meager breakfast, peasants set out to their fields, or other tasks assigned by the lord. Labor included plowing fields with primitive wooden plows, sowing seeds by hand, weeding, harvesting crops, or repairing fences and irrigation ditches. Plowing was perhaps the most physically demanding job. Without modern machinery, peasants relied on oxen or horses to pull heavy wooden plows through tough soil. The peasant guiding the plow needed strength and skill to keep the furrow straight and to manage the animals. Days of plowing could leave peasants sore and exhausted, but the success of the entire year's harvest depended on it. Sowing seeds was another meticulous task. Peasants walked long distances scattering seeds by hand, a process requiring attention to detail to ensure even growth. Weeding was backbreaking and continuous work, as unwanted plants could quickly choke crops if left unchecked. Harvest time brought its own demands, with peasants using sickles or scythes to cut grain before it spoiled. In addition to farming, peasants had duties such as tending to animals, cattle, sheep, pigs, and chickens, which provided meat, milk, wool, and eggs. Caring for livestock involved feeding, cleaning pens, milking, and protecting animals from predators. Many peasants kept small vegetable gardens and orchards for additional food, which required constant attention. Apart from working their own plots, peasants were obligated to perform labor on the lord's lands. This corvée labor was unpaid, and often involved the most arduous tasks, such as maintaining roads, building fences, or clearing forests. The physical toll was heavy, especially since peasants had to complete these duties before or after tending to their own fields. Seasonal festivals and holy days occasionally offered brief relief from work, but these were few and far between. Even during celebrations, peasants might be called back early to complete urgent tasks, and work often resumed immediately afterward. The constant demand for labor left little time for leisure, education, or personal pursuits. Work conditions were harsh, with peasants exposed to the elements, scorching sun, driving rain, biting cold, without adequate clothing or shelter. Injuries were common, from cuts and bruises to animal bites and accidents with farming tools. Medical care was rudimentary and often unavailable, meaning minor wounds could become deadly infections. The mental strain of endless labor was compounded by the uncertainty of survival. A failed harvest due to drought, flood, or pests meant starvation and destitution. Peasants lived with constant anxiety over factors beyond their control, yet they had no option but to toil harder in hopes of a better yield. Children were not exempt from the labor demands. From a young age, they were expected to help with chores, learn farming skills, and contribute to the family's survival. This early introduction to work shaped their entire lives, often at the expense of childhood and education. Women's labor was equally strenuous but often underappreciated. Besides working in the fields, women managed household duties such as cooking, cleaning, spinning wool, making clothes, and caring for children. During busy seasons, women might also assist with harvesting or animal care. Their workload was a constant balancing act between domestic responsibilities and agricultural labor. The never-ending toil of peasants was a key factor in the social stability of medieval society. Lords depended on this labor to maintain their wealth and power, while peasants depended on the land and lords' protection for survival. This mutual dependence was unequal and fraught with tension but held the system together for centuries. In summary, the daily grind for medieval peasants was grueling and relentless. From dawn till dusk, their lives were shaped by physical exhaustion, environmental challenges, and social obligations that left little room for rest or hope. The phrase, "work from dawn till dusk," does not just describe a day's schedule, it encapsulates the very essence of peasant life, a ceaseless struggle to survive against overwhelming odds. For medieval peasants, living conditions were a brutal and relentless source of suffering, overshadowing any fleeting moments of relief they might have experienced. Unlike today, where sanitation and health infrastructure protect most people from preventable diseases and promote hygiene, the medieval village was a grim environment where dirt, filth, and disease were constant companions. Peasants lived in homes that were little more than shelters against the elements, surrounded by unsanitary conditions that fostered illness and shortened life expectancy. Understanding these living conditions is essential to grasping why medieval peasant life was so dominated by hardship, fear, and despair. The typical peasant dwelling was a small, one-room cottage made from wattle and daub, a mixture of woven wooden strips coated with mud, straw, and manure, with a thatched roof. These houses were cramped, dark, and drafty, often measuring barely 10 to 15 feet in width and length. Inside, a central hearth provided warmth and a place to cook, but the smoke had little way to escape, filling the cottage with thick, choking fumes. The floors were usually bare earth, compacted over time but never truly clean. Peasants might spread rushes or straw to cover the floor, but these became breeding grounds for insects and vermin rather than a hygienic barrier. Sleeping arrangements were cramped. The entire family often slept on a single straw mattress, or pile of blankets, with no separation or privacy. Bedbugs, fleas, and lice thrived in this environment, biting relentlessly and spreading disease. Water sources were often nearby streams or wells, but these were frequently contaminated with human and animal waste. Medieval peasants had little understanding of germs or sanitation, so drinking and washing water were easily polluted. This contributed heavily to outbreaks of waterborne illnesses such as dysentery, cholera, and typhoid. Sanitation infrastructure was virtually non-existent. Peasants relied on simple latrines or pit toilets located close to their homes, which filled quickly and were rarely cleaned properly. In many villages, human waste was disposed of in open cesspits or simply thrown into the streets or fields. Manure from animals kept close to homes added to the filth, attracting flies and rodents. These unsanitary conditions created perfect breeding grounds for disease. Epidemics were frequent and devastating, wiping out large portions of villages and leaving survivors with grief, fear, and increased workloads. The Black Death of the 14th century, which killed an estimated 30–60% of Europe's population, was the most infamous example, but lesser plagues, fevers, and infections were common year after year. Nutrition also played a major role in peasants' vulnerability to disease. With their meager diets, mostly coarse bread, watery pottage, and occasional vegetables or salted meats, peasants lacked the vitamins and minerals needed for strong immune systems. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making even minor infections life-threatening. The harsh living conditions also took a toll on mental health. The constant presence of filth, disease, and cramped living quarters created a suffocating environment that bred despair and hopelessness. Children grew up knowing illness and death as everyday realities, and adults faced the relentless stress of caring for large families under these brutal conditions. Personal hygiene was difficult to maintain. Bathing was rare and considered a luxury, or even dangerous by some medieval beliefs. Without regular washing or clean clothes, body odor and infections were widespread. Clothes were often patched and worn for years, harboring lice and other parasites. Peasant villages themselves were tightly packed with houses clustered closely along dirt roads, or near the lord's manor. This proximity meant that illnesses spread rapidly through communities. Quarantine or isolation was unheard of, so once disease entered a village, it was difficult to control. In winter, conditions worsened as cold, dampness, and lack of food combined to increase mortality. Without proper insulation or heating, many peasants suffered from frostbite or respiratory illnesses. Hunger was a seasonal constant for many, with stored food supplies dwindling before the next harvest. Despite these grim realities, peasants developed some strategies to cope. Herbal remedies and folk medicine, passed down through generations, were used to treat wounds, fevers, and other ailments. Local healers or wise women played important roles in communities, though their knowledge was limited. Communal life helped offset isolation and hardship. Villagers shared labor, food, and support during times of crisis. Religious faith also offered comfort, with the church providing some charity and rituals to ease suffering. However, these supports were often insufficient against the overwhelming challenges of medieval living. In summary, medieval peasants lived in conditions that by modern standards would be considered abject poverty and neglect. The constant presence of dirt, disease, and despair defined their daily existence, shaping a life where survival was precarious and hardship was the norm. These conditions were not incidental but systemic, reflecting the social and economic structures that prioritized the wealth and comfort of the nobility over the health and dignity of the peasantry. Life as a medieval peasant was not just about hard physical labor and dreadful living conditions, it was also dominated by an almost unbearable financial and social burden, imposed by the complex system of feudal obligations. Taxes and tithes were the invisible chains that kept peasants tied to their lords and the church, extracting a significant portion of their limited resources year after year. Understanding these burdens is crucial to fully appreciating the relentless hardship and constant fear that shaped the peasants' existence. The feudal system was built on a hierarchy of power and land ownership, with peasants at the very bottom. Lords owned vast estates and controlled the peasants who worked their lands. In return for protection and the right to farm small plots of land, peasants owed their lord various payments and services, often in the form of taxes, labor, and goods. These obligations were non-negotiable and ruthlessly enforced. One of the most significant financial burdens was the rent, or tax peasants paid to their lord for the use of land. This was often paid in kind, meaning peasants gave a portion of their crops, grain, vegetables, or livestock, rather than money. Sometimes it was paid in labor, with peasants required to work the lord's fields for a set number of days, per week or month. This system, known as corvée labor, was mandatory and unpaid, sapping peasants' time and energy from their own farms. In many cases, these rents or taxes took up a large portion of the peasants' production, leaving little for themselves and their families. After paying the lord's dues, peasants often struggled to save enough seed for the next planting season or to store food for winter. This constant drain meant they were always vulnerable to famine or financial ruin if crops failed or unexpected events occurred. The church also extracted its share through tithes, a tax typically amounting to 1/10 of the peasant's produce or income. This was meant to support the local parish, clergy, and religious institutions, but the financial strain on peasants was severe. Even during years of poor harvest, the tithe was expected in full, forcing peasants to sacrifice their own food and resources. Beyond rents and tithes, peasants were subject to a bewildering array of other fees and taxes. These could include payments for using the lord's mill to grind grain, fees for baking bread in the communal oven, charges for fishing or hunting rights, and tolls for crossing roads or bridges. Each of these added layers of expense drained peasants' limited means. The Lord's court had broad powers to enforce these obligations, and peasants who failed to meet their dues faced harsh punishments. These could include fines, confiscation of property, or even imprisonment. The constant fear of penalties added mental stress to the physical and economic hardships peasants endured. Many peasants were also serfs, legally bound to the land they worked. This meant they could not leave without the Lord's permission, and were subject to his jurisdiction. Serfdom restricted personal freedom and trapped families in a cycle of dependence and poverty, passed down through generations. Peasants' homes and possessions were also subject to taxation. Lords could demand payments for rebuilding or repairing houses, for marriages, or for inheritance rights. These extra levies were unpredictable and often exploited, worsening peasants' precarious situations. The economic burden of taxes and obligations often forced peasants into debt. To meet payments or survive bad seasons, they borrowed from local moneylenders or the Lord himself, typically at high interest rates. Debt could be a trap, leading to loss of land, freedom, or worse. Despite this crushing load, peasants had few legal rights or avenues for redress. The feudal system was heavily skewed in favor of nobility and clergy, who controlled courts, laws, and enforcement. Peasants had to accept their lot, or risk brutal consequences for rebellion or evasion. Occasionally, peasants revolted against excessive taxation and oppression. Famous uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381 were fueled by unbearable financial burdens and abuses. While some revolts temporarily won concessions, they were usually crushed violently, reaffirming the rigid social order. In essence, the tax and tithe system was an unyielding weight on the medieval peasants' shoulders. Every grain harvested, every animal raised, was partly owed to a lord or the church, leaving peasants with barely enough to survive. This economic exploitation was central to feudalism and was a primary cause of the peasants' perpetual hardship and regret. For medieval peasants, life was ruled by the unrelenting rhythm of work. Unlike the occasional breaks and weekends familiar to modern society, peasants faced a daily grind that left little time for rest or leisure. From dawn until dusk, and throughout the seasons, peasants toiled in fields, tended animals, repaired homes, and fulfilled demands imposed by their lords. The endless cycle of labor was exhausting, physically punishing, and mentally draining, a defining feature of their existence. The backbone of peasant labor was agriculture. Peasants were primarily subsistence farmers, meaning they grew crops mainly to feed themselves and their families, with only a small surplus available for taxes and trade. Farming was physically demanding, and depended heavily on weather, soil quality, and seasons. The medieval plow, although an improvement over earlier tools, required significant muscle power to operate, especially when turning the heavy, clay-rich soil common in many parts of Europe. From early spring, peasants prepared the fields by clearing weeds, plowing, and sowing seeds. These tasks had to be done quickly to take advantage of short growing seasons. As the summer progressed, peasants weeded and tended their crops to ensure a decent harvest. This involved back-breaking work, often done bent over or on hands and knees, under the blazing sun or pouring rain. Harvest time in late summer and early autumn was the most intense and crucial period. Peasants harvested grain with sickles, cutting stalks by hand before binding them into sheaves. The work was hurried, as delays could lead to crop loss from weather or pests. After gathering the crops, peasants threshed and winnowed to separate grain from chaff, tasks that required additional hours of labor. Beyond the staple crops like wheat, rye, and barley, peasants grew vegetables such as beans, peas, onions, and cabbages in small kitchen gardens. They also kept animals including chickens, pigs, goats, and sometimes cattle. Caring for animals meant daily chores of feeding, watering, cleaning, and protecting them from predators. But peasants' work extended far beyond their own plots. Feudal obligations required peasants to spend part of their week working the Lord's demesne, the land reserved for the Lord's use. This corvée labor could consume several days, each week during busy seasons. Peasants had little control over these demands, which often disrupted their own farming and added to exhaustion. In addition to farming and labor on the Lord's lands, peasants were responsible for maintaining village infrastructure. This included repairing roads, fences, bridges, and communal buildings like barns or mills. These tasks, often performed collectively, were essential but laborious. Peasant women carried a heavy workload as well. They managed household chores such as cooking, cleaning, fetching water, spinning wool, weaving cloth, and caring for children. Women also participated in agricultural work, helping with planting, harvesting, and processing crops. Their contributions were vital to family survival, but often went unrecognized in historical records. Children, too, entered the labor force early. From a young age, boys learned farming tasks by assisting fathers, while girls helped their mothers with household duties. Education was rare, and childhood was brief, replaced quickly by the demands of survival. The daily schedule of a peasant was structured around daylight hours. Without artificial lighting, work began at first light and ended at dusk. This meant long days in all seasons, including the bitter cold of winter or the sweltering heat of summer. There were few holidays or rest days. The calendar was marked mainly by church festivals, which offered brief respite but often still required labor or religious duties. Physical exhaustion was a constant companion. The heavy labor took a toll on bodies already weakened by poor nutrition and disease. Back pain, joint problems, and injuries from tools or animals were common. Medical care was limited and often ineffective. So many ailments became chronic or fatal. Despite the grueling work, peasants had little control over their lives. The unpredictability of weather, crop failures, and pest infestations meant that years of hard labor could be wiped out in months or even weeks. Famine was a recurring threat, exacerbated by poor harvests and the demands of taxes and tithes. The burden of work extended even to celebrations or social events. Weddings, festivals, and church holidays often required peasants to contribute food, labor, or money. Preparation for these events added to the workload, limiting any chance of true rest or enjoyment. Peasants found some solace in communal cooperation. Tasks like harvesting or building were often done as a group, fostering a sense of shared struggle and support. This cooperation was necessary for survival, as many tasks were impossible to complete alone. Still, the relentless cycle of work with little reward created a profound sense of frustration and regret. Peasants were trapped in a system where their labor enriched others, the Lord and the Church, while they struggled to meet their own basic needs. The hope for a better life was slim, and the harsh reality of toil was all they knew. In conclusion, the endless cycle of work defined medieval peasant life. From dawn to dusk, through every season, peasants labored without rest or relief, bound by obligations and the harsh demands of survival. This ceaseless toil was a source of physical exhaustion, mental strain, and enduring hardship, painting a vivid picture of why being a medieval peasant was truly a life of dirt, taxes, and regret.